Picture this. A man loses an entire empire because he's afraid of crossing a river. A military genius gets defeated by rabbits. An entire army disappears because they followed the wrong road signs. And somewhere in history, a single typo cost a company $57 million. What if I told you that some of the most catastrophic moments in human history weren't caused by evil masterminds or natural disasters, but by the kind of mistakes that would make you facepalm so hard you'd leave a permanent handprint? The truth is, behind every great civilization, every mighty empire, and every historical legend, there's usually someone who made such a spectacularly absurd blunder that it defies belief. Today, we're diving into 50 of history's most jaw-dropping, side-splitting, and downright unbelievable mistakes. These aren't just any mistakes. These are the kind of blunders that changed the course of nations, toppled governments, and left historians scratching their heads for centuries. And the best part? They're all at blunder number 1. Xerxes versus the ocean. The year was 480 BC, and Persian king Xerxes had a problem. He wanted to invade Greece, but there was this annoying body of water called the Hellespont blocking his path. Now, most rulers might have built more boats or found another route, but Xerxes, he decided to punish the ocean itself. According to the historian Herodotus, Xerxes was so furious with the sea for destroying his bridge that he ordered his soldiers to give the water 300 lashes with whips. But it gets better. He also had them throw chains into the water to imprison the sea and brand it with hot irons. Imagine being the soldier who had to explain that job to your family. The ocean, surprisingly, remained unimpressed by this display of royal authority. Xerxes eventually built another bridge, invaded Greece, and was promptly defeated at the Battle of Salamis. Perhaps the sea had the last laugh after all. Blunder number 2. Troy's worst home security decision. Everyone knows about the Trojan horse, but let's really think about this for a moment. After 10 years of brutal warfare, the Greeks suddenly pack up and leave, but not before thoughtfully leaving behind a massive wooden horse as a gift. The Trojans look at this obvious trap and think, you know what? This seems totally legitimate. Let's bring it inside our impenetrable city walls. Even more mind-boggling is that according to legend, they had to partially demolish their own walls to get the thing inside. Picture the conversation. Honey, should we really be tearing down our defenses to accommodate this suspicious gift from our enemies? Don't be paranoid, dear. What's the worst that could happen? The priest Laocoon famously warned, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. But did anyone listen? Apparently not. That night, Greek soldiers poured out of the horse and opened the city gates. Troy fell, and the phrase, looking a gift horse in the mouth, took on a whole new meaning. Blunder number 3. Hannibal's Elephant Express. Hannibal Barca had what seemed like a brilliant idea. Cross the Alps with elephants to surprise the Romans. On paper, it sounds incredible. Imagine the look on Roman faces when war elephants come thundering over the mountains. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare that would make any modern event planner weep. First, elephants are tropical animals. They don't do well in snow. Second, mountain passes are narrow and treacherous. Third, elephants are huge, heavy, and not particularly good at mountaineering. Out of the 37 elephants that started the journey, only one survived, and that poor creature died shortly after reaching Italy. But here's the kicker. Hannibal actually won several battles against the Romans, despite losing almost all his elephants. It makes you wonder if maybe he should have just stuck with horses like everyone else. Sometimes the most audacious plans are audacious for a reason. Blunder number 4. Emperor Caligula's war on Neptune. If you thought Xerxes whipping the ocean was strange, wait until you hear about Emperor Caligula's military campaign against the sea god Neptune. Caligula, who wasn't exactly known for his sanity, decided to invade Britain but got distracted by the English Channel. Instead of, actually crossing it, he declared war on Neptune himself. He ordered his legions to march to the beach and stab the waves with their swords. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war. He even built a lighthouse to commemorate his victory over the ocean. The soldiers, being professional Romans, probably just went along with it while quietly updating their resumes. Caligula returned to Rome, claiming total victory, and the Roman Senate, showing remarkable political wisdom, didn't ask too many questions about the specifics of this aquatic conquest. Pause. The medieval period was a time of chivalry, honor, and some of the most spectacularly absurd decision-making in human history. Blunder number 5, the Children's Crusade. In 1212, a French boy named Stephen claimed that Jesus had appeared to him and commanded him to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. The plan was simple. Thousands of children would march to the Mediterranean. The sea would part, like in the Bible, and they would walk to Jerusalem. What could possibly go wrong? About 30,000 children gathered and began their march. When they reached the Mediterranean at Marseilles, they stood on the beach waiting for the miracle. The sea, showing a disturbing pattern of not cooperating with grand historical gestures, remained stubbornly unparted. Some sources say the children were sold into slavery by merchants who had promised them free passage. Others claim they simply went home disappointed. Either way, it was a harsh lesson in the importance of having a backup plan when your strategy relies on divine intervention. Blunder number 6, King John versus the washing machine. King John of England wasn't just bad at ruling, he was spectacularly, legendarily terrible at it. But one of his most absurd moments came when he decided to cross the Wash, a large bay in eastern England, during low tide with his entire baggage train. The Wash was known for its dangerous tides and quicksand, but John figured he could make it across. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The tide came in faster than expected, and the royal baggage train, including the crown jewels, was swallowed by the water. John escaped, but he lost nearly everything of value that the English monarchy owned. It was such a devastating loss that some historians believe it contributed to his death shortly afterward. He literally lost. Blunder number 7, the Pope who put a dead man on trial. Pope Stephen VI had what might charitably be called issues with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. These issues were so severe that Stephen decided to put Formosus on trial, which would have been a normal papal power struggle, except for one tiny detail. Formosus had been dead for 7 months. In 897 AD, Stephen ordered that Formosus's corpse be dug up, dressed in papal robes, and placed on a throne in the Vatican for trial. A deacon was appointed to speak for the deceased pope, though historians don't record how enthusiastic he was about this assignment. The corpse was found guilty of various charges, had 3 fingers cut off, and was thrown into the Tiber River. The Roman people, showing remarkably good judgment for once, were so horrified by this spectacle that they revolted and threw Stephen in prison, where he was later strangled. Within a blunder number 8, the dancing plague of 1518. In July 1518, in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in the street. Nothing unusual there. People dance all the time. But Frau Trophia didn't stop. She kept dancing for days. Then, more people joined her. Within a week, About 34 people were dancing uncontrollably. The local authorities, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the cure for this dancing mania was more dancing. They brought in musicians, built a stage, and encouraged even more people to dance. Their logic was that the dancers would eventually dance it out of their systems. Instead, the dancing spread. At its peak, around 400 people were dancing non-stop in the streets of Strasbourg. Some reportedly danced themselves to death from exhaustion. The authorities finally figured out that maybe bringing in more music wasn't helping, but by then, the dancing plague had become one of history's most bizarre mass hysteria events. War is serious business, but sometimes military leaders make decisions so baffling that they belong in a comedy sketch rather than a history book. Blunder number 9, Napoleon's Rabbit Rampage. After signing the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon decided to celebrate with a rabbit hunt. His chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, was put in charge of organizing the event. Berthier gathered hundreds of rabbits for the occasion, and everything seemed perfectly planned. But when the rabbits were released, something went terribly wrong. Instead of running away like proper prey, they charged directly at Napoleon and his men. The Emperor of France found himself under assault by hundreds of furious rabbits. They swarmed his legs, jumped into his jacket, and one reportedly made it into his carriage. What Berthier hadn't considered was that he'd bought tame domestic rabbits instead of wild ones. These rabbits weren't afraid of humans. They associated them with food. So when they saw Napoleon and his party, they thought it was dinner time. The mighty conqueror who had dominated Europe was forced to retreat in the face of an army of hungry bunnies. Blunder number 10, the Great Emu War. In 1932, Australia faced a serious problem. Emus, thousands of these large, flightless birds, were destroying crops in Western Australia, and the governments decided to handle it military style. They sent in the army with machine guns to wage war on the emus. This sounds like it should have been easy. Train soldiers with automatic weapons against birds. But the emus proved to be surprisingly effective guerrilla fighters. They were fast, they scattered when attacked, and their loose feathers absorbed bullets remarkably well. Major GPW. After several weeks of combat, the military had used thousands of rounds of ammunition and killed only a few hundred emus. The operation was eventually called off, and the emus were declared the winners. To this day, it remains the only war that Australia has definitively lost. Blunder number 11, the charge of the Light Brigade's Wrong Valley. During the Crimean War in 1854, the British Light Brigade received orders to attack Russian forces. The problem was that the orders were vague, and the messenger had no idea which Russian forces they were supposed to attack. Lord Lucan, who received the orders, asked Captain Edward Nolan for clarification. Nolan pointed toward the Russians, but from where they stood, he could see the wrong group of enemy forces, heavily defended artillery positions, instead of the intended target. 670 cavalry soldiers charged directly into a valley surrounded by Russian cannons. It was, as Alfred Tennyson later wrote, a blunder. The Light Brigade was decimated, with over 200 casualties, all because someone pointed in the wrong direction. The French Marshal Pierre Bosquet, watching from nearby, summed it up perfectly. It is magnificent, but it is not war. Sometimes the most famous military disasters come down to simple miscommunication. Blunder number 12, the Maginot Line Oversight. After World War I, France decided they never wanted to face another German invasion. So they built the Maginot Line. an elaborate system of fortifications along the French-German border. It was an engineering marvel, virtually impregnable, and gave the French tremendous confidence. There was just one tiny problem. It didn't cover the Belgian border. The French assumed that Belgium was safe because it was neutral, and besides, the Ardennes forest was too thick for tanks to pass through quickly. In 1940, the Germans proved them wrong by doing exactly what the French thought was impossible. They went through Belgium and the Ardennes, completely bypassing the Maginot Line. The French had spent enormous resources building an unbreachable wall, and then left the back door wide open. Blunder number 13, the Japanese balloon bombs. During World War II, Japan came up with an innovative way to attack the American mainland: balloon bombs. The plan was to launch thousands of balloons carrying explosives, let the jet stream carry them across the Pacific, and hope they would cause chaos in the United States. The Japanese launched about 9,000 of these balloon bombs. Only about 300 ever reached North America, and most of those landed harmlessly in remote areas. The only casualties were a Sunday school teacher and 5 children on a picnic in Oregon who found an unexploded balloon and accidentally triggered it. But here's the truly absurd part. The Japanese had no way of knowing if their balloon bombs were working because American censors kept all reports out of the newspapers. So Japan kept wasting resources on a weapon that was achieving virtually nothing. While America kept the failure secret to avoid giving away how ineffective the attacks were, the age of exploration brought us many great discoveries. But it also gave us some magnificently catastrophic navigation failures. Blunder number 14, Christopher Columbus's math problem. Columbus is famous for discovering America, but he's equally famous for being completely wrong about where he was going. He thought he could reach Asia by sailing west from Europe, which wasn't necessarily a bad idea, except for his calculations. Columbus estimated that the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, and that Asia was much larger. He thought Japan was about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands. The actual distance to Japan is about 10,600 miles, which is off by just a tiny bit, about 8,200 miles. If America hadn't existed, Columbus and his crew would have died of thirst and starvation somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. He got lucky that there happened to be a couple of continents exactly where he didn't expect them to be. Even after reaching the Caribbean, he insisted until his death that he had found islands off the coast of Asia. Blunder number 15, the Donner Party's shortcut to disaster. In 1846, the Donner Party decided to take a shortcut to California called Hastings Cutoff. This route was supposed to save them 400 miles and several weeks of travel. It sounded too good to be true, and as it turned out, it was. The shortcut led them through some of the most difficult terrain in the American West. Instead of saving time, they lost precious weeks struggling through salt flats and mountains. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, winter had arrived early, trapping them in heavy snow. What followed was one of the most harrowing survival stories in American history, involving cannibalism and death. Only 48 of the original 87 members survived. The irony is bitter. If they had just taken the regular route, they would have reached California safely with time to spare. Blunder number 16, Robert Falcon Scott's race to nowhere. British explorer Robert Falcon Scott had his heart set on being the first person to reach the South Pole. He organized an expedition with the best equipment and supplies money could buy. Unfortunately, his planning had some serious flaws. Scott decided to use ponies and motor sledges instead of sled dogs, which proved to be a terrible choice in Antarctic conditions. The ponies weren't suited for extreme cold, and the motor sledges broke down. Meanwhile, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was racing to the same goal using sled dogs and superior cold weather knowledge. When Scott finally reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, he found a Norwegian flag and a note from Amundsen, who had beaten him by 34 days. Scott wrote in his diary, "Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." The return journey was even more tragic. Scott and his entire party died on the way back, partly due to the poor planning that had plagued the expedition from the beginning. Blunder number 17, the Franklin Expedition's Vanishing Act. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail with 2 ships and 129 men to find the Northwest Passage through the Arctic. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of British naval exploration. Instead, it became one of history's most mysterious disasters. The expedition's ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were state-of-the-art vessels with the latest technology, including experimental heating systems and 3 years' worth of food supplies. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The ships became trapped in ice in the Victoria Strait, and the entire expedition disappeared without a trace. Search parties spent years looking for them, and while they found some remains and artifacts, the full story of what happened remained a mystery for over 150 years. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that the crew suffered from lead poisoning from their canned food, scurvy, starvation, and extreme cold. Some resorted to cannibalism in their final days. The most advanced Arctic expedition of its time was doomed by contaminated food and bad ice conditions. Politics has always been messy, but some diplomatic blunders are so spectacular they deserve their own category of historical facepalms. Blunder number 18, the War of Jenkins' Ear. In 1731, Spanish Coast Guards boarded British Captain Robert Jenkins' ship and, according to Jenkins, cut off his ear as punishment for smuggling. 8 years later, Jenkins appeared before the British Parliament carrying what he claimed was his severed ear in a jar, demanding justice. The British government, looking for an excuse to go to war with Spain over trade disputes, used this incident as justification for conflict. The War of Jenkins' Ear lasted from 1739 to 1748 and cost thousands of lives and enormous sums of money. The absurd part is that historians aren't even sure if Jenkins' ear was actually cut off, or if the ear he showed Parliament was even his own ear. But Britain went to war anyway, fought for 9 years, and achieved essentially nothing. It's possibly the only war in history named after a body part. Blunder number 19, the pig war that almost wasn't. In 1859, the border between British Columbia and Washington State was disputed, particularly around the San Juan Islands. Tensions were high, but the situation remained peaceful until June 15th, when American farmer Lyman Cutler found a pig eating his potatoes. The pig belonged to British subject Charles Griffin. Cutler shot and killed the pig. Griffin demanded compensation. Cutler offered $10. Griffin wanted $100. Things escalated rapidly from there. Both sides called in military reinforcements. Soon, 461 American soldiers and 14 cannons faced off against 2,140 British troops and 31 cannons, all over one dead pig worth maybe $5. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the only casualty of the pig war was the pig itself. The border dispute was eventually settled by international arbitration, with the Americans keeping the San Juan Islands. But for a moment there, two major powers almost went to war because someone couldn't be bothered to fence their potato patch properly. Blunder number 20. The Louisiana Purchase bargain. Napoleon needed money to fund his European wars, so he decided to sell Louisiana to the United States. This wasn't just New Orleans. It was the entire Louisiana territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The American negotiators, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, were authorized to spend up to $10 million to buy New Orleans. When Napoleon offered them the whole territory for $15 million, they were so shocked they almost didn't believe it. Napoleon essentially sold 827,000 square miles, about 23% of the current United States, for roughly 4 cents an acre. It doubled the size of America overnight and included parts or all of 15 future states. It was arguably the greatest real estate deal in history. The French realized too late what they had given up. Napoleon later called it the greatest mistake of my life, which is saying something for a man who decided to invade Russia in winter and met his final defeat at Waterloo. Blunder number 21. The Zimmermann Telegram. In 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. The message proposed that if the United States entered World War I, Mexico should join Germany as an ally and receive Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as rewards. It was a reasonable diplomatic strategy, except for one small problem. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram. They passed it along to the Americans, who were understandably less than thrilled to discover that Germany was trying to give away their southwestern states. The revelation of the Zimmermann telegram helped push American public opinion toward entering the war on the side of the Allies. Germany had essentially handed their enemies the perfect propaganda tool to justify American involvement in a European conflict. But here's the kicker. When confronted with the telegram, Zimmermann could have denied it or claimed it was a British forgery. Instead, he admitted it was genuine, confirming to the world that Germany really was plotting against American territory. Science and technology have given us countless innovations, but they've also produced some gloriously ridiculous failures. Blunder number 22, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge dance party. When the Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened in 1940, it was hailed as an engineering marvel. The graceful suspension bridge was elegant, cost-effective, and had a slight tendency to sway in the wind, which actually made it quite popular with thrill-seekers who enjoyed the roller coaster effect. The bridge became known as Galloping Gertie because of its bouncing motion. Engineers assured everyone that this was perfectly normal and nothing to worry about. On November 7, 1940, they discovered just how wrong they were. A moderate wind of 42 miles per hour caused the bridge to begin oscillating violently. Instead of the usual gentle sway, the entire roadway began twisting and buckling like a ribbon. Within hours, the bridge tore itself apart in a spectacular display of aerodynamic resonance. The only casualty was a Cocker Spaniel named Tubby, who was trapped in a car on the bridge. His owner escaped, but Tubby was too frightened to leave the vehicle. The collapse was filmed and became one of the most famous engineering disaster videos in history, shown in physics classes worldwide as an example of what happens when you don't account for wind dynamics. Blunder number 23, the Mars Climate Orbiter's Unit Problem. In 1998, NASA launched the Mars Climate Orbiter, a $125 million spacecraft designed to study Martian weather and climate. After a 9-month journey through space, the orbiter was supposed to enter orbit around Mars and begin its mission. Instead, it disappeared. The investigation revealed one of the most expensive typos in history. Lockheed Martin had programmed their navigation software using English units, pounds of force, while NASA software expected metric units, newtons. The spacecraft's trajectory was off by a factor of 4.45, causing it to approach Mars far too closely and burn up in the atmosphere. A $125 million mission was lost because someone forgot to convert between pounds and newtons. It was the kind of mistake that students get marked wrong on physics homework, except this one cost more than most countries' annual budgets. Blunder number 24. The millennium bug that wasn't. As the year 2000 approached, computer experts warned of a catastrophic problem. Many computer systems stored years as two-digit numbers. So when 1999 became 2000, computers might interpret it as 1900. This could cause widespread system failures. Governments and businesses spent an estimated $300 billion worldwide preparing for Y2K. People stockpiled food and water. Some predicted that airplanes would fall from the sky, nuclear power plants would fail, and civilization would collapse. When midnight struck on January 1st, 2000, the world held its breath, and then, almost nothing happened. A few minor glitches occurred, but no major disasters. The most significant Y2K-related problem might have been the hangover from all the New Year's parties. The question remains, was Y2K a non-event because we spent so much money fixing it? Or was it never really a serious threat to begin with? Either way, it was the most expensive software bug in history, whether it actually existed or not. Blunder 25. Thomas Edison's elephant electrocution. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla were engaged in the War of Currents, a battle over whether direct current, Edison's system, or alternating current, Tesla's system, would become the standard for electrical power distribution. Edison, determined to prove that AC current was dangerous, staged public demonstrations where he electrocuted animals. The most infamous of these was the execution of Topsy, a circus elephant who had killed 3 men and was scheduled to be put to death anyway. On January 4th, 1903, before a crowd of 1,500 spectators, Edison's team fed Topsy poisoned carrots and then electrocuted her with 6,600 volts of AC current. Edison filmed the execution and distributed it as a movie called Electrocuting an Elephant. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of convincing people that AC current was too dangerous, the elephant's death generated enormous negative publicity for Edison. Tesla's AC system eventually became the standard anyway, and Edison's reputation suffered from what many saw as needless animal cruelty in service of a corporate dispute. The world of business has produced some truly spectacular examples of how not to make money. Blunder number 26, tulip mania. In the 1630s, the Netherlands experienced one of history's first recorded economic bubbles, and it was centered around tulips. Yes, flowers. Tulip bulbs became so valuable that at the peak of the mania, a single bulb could cost more than a house. People mortgaged their homes to buy tulip bulbs. Skilled craftsmen traded their workshops for a handful of bulbs. One particularly rare bulb, called Semper Augustus, was worth 6,000 florins, enough to feed, clothe, and house an entire family for half a lifetime. The bubble burst as suddenly as it had formed. In February 1637, tulip prices collapsed overnight. People who had been millionaires on paper found themselves holding worthless bulbs and crushing debts. The Dutch economy took years to recover from what became known as tulip mania. The most absurd part is that the whole crisis was over flowers that bloom for about a week each year. It's a perfect example of how market psychology can create value out of thin air and destroy it just as quickly. Blunder number 27, New Coke. In 1985, Coca-Cola was facing competition from Pepsi and decided they needed to reformulate their flagship product. After extensive taste tests, they created New Coke, a sweeter formula that supposedly tasted better than both original Coke and Pepsi. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola announced that they were replacing their 99-year-old formula with New Coke. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Americans responded as if Coca-Cola had declared war on apple pie and baseball. Angry customers hoarded old Coke. Protest groups formed, and the company received over 400,000 calls and letters of complaint. Some people compared it to the grief they felt when losing a family member. After just 79 days, Coca-Cola brought back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic. The irony is that New Coke actually did taste better in blind taste tests. But Coca-Cola had underestimated the emotional attachment people had to the original formula. They learned that sometimes being objectively better isn't enough if you're messing with something people love. Blunder number 28, the South Sea Bubble. In 1711, the British government was heavily in debt from various wars. The South Sea Company offered to take over the national debt in exchange for a monopoly on trade with South America. It sounded like a brilliant financial innovation. There was just one problem. Britain was at war with Spain, which controlled most of South America. The South Sea Company had a monopoly on trade that was essentially impossible to conduct. But that didn't stop investors from going crazy for South Sea stock. By 1720, South Sea Company shares had risen from £100 to over £1,000. Everyone wanted in on the action, including Isaac Newton, who reportedly said he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of the people. When the bubble burst, it wiped out fortunes across Britain. Newton himself lost the equivalent of millions in today's money. The company's directors were arrested, and the British economy was devastated. It was a harsh lesson in the dangers of investing in businesses with no actual business to speak of. Blunder number 29, Quibi's $1.75 billion question. In 2020, media moguls Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman launched Quibi, a streaming service designed exclusively for mobile phones. The concept was simple: high-quality, short-form content that people could watch on their phones during brief moments of downtime. Quibi raised $1.75 billion in funding, hired A-list celebrities, and produced content that cost millions per episode. They were confident they had identified the future of entertainment. They launched in April 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic began. The timing couldn't have been worse. People were stuck at home with plenty of time and big screens, not looking for quick mobile content during their commute. Quibi attracted only 500,000 paying subscribers in its first 6 months, far below the millions they needed to survive. In October 2020, just 6 months after launch, Quibi announced it was shutting down. They had burned through nearly $2 billion in the shortest time possible, creating content that nobody wanted to watch in the middle of a global pandemic that changed how people consumed media. Sometimes entire societies make decisions that seem baffling in hindsight. Blunder number 30, the Great Sparrow Campaign. In 1958, Chinese leader Mao Zedong decided that sparrows were an enemy of the people. As part of the Four Pests campaign, he declared war on sparrows, reasoning that they ate grain that could feed humans. The entire population of China was mobilized to eliminate sparrows. For 3 days, virtually every person in China banged pots, pans, drums, and anything else that made noise to prevent sparrows from landing and resting. The birds, unable to find places to perch, eventually died of exhaustion. Millions of sparrows were killed in what was probably the most coordinated bird genocide in history. The campaign was remarkably successful at killing sparrows. Unfortunately, sparrows don't just eat grain, they also eat insects. With the sparrow population decimated, insect populations exploded. Locusts and other pests destroyed crops across China, contributing to a famine that killed millions of people. Within a year, Chinese scientists pointed out that sparrows actually eat more insects than grain, making them beneficial to agriculture. Mao quietly removed sparrows from the list of pests and replaced them with bedbugs. But the ecological damage was already done, and the Great Chinese Famine was partly a result of declaring war on birds. Blunder number 31. The Salem Witch Trials. In 1692, several young girls in Salem, Massachusetts began exhibiting strange behavior, screaming, convulsing, and claiming to see invisible forces. Rather than considering medical or psychological explanations, the community concluded that witchcraft was involved. What followed was one of history's most infamous examples of mass hysteria. Over the course of several months, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 people were executed, and many more died in prison. The evidence used in these trials would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. People were convicted based on spectral evidence, claims that their spirits were seen causing harm even when their physical bodies were elsewhere. Others were condemned because they couldn't perfectly recite the Lord's Prayer, or because they had unusual birthmarks. The trials ended when accusations began targeting prominent members of society, including the governor's wife. Suddenly, the standards of evidence became much more rigorous. By 1693, the remaining accused were released, and the colony began to realize they had made a terrible mistake. Blunder number 32. The Prohibition Experiment. In 1920, the United States banned the production, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages with the 18th Amendment. The idea was to reduce crime, corruption, and social problems caused by alcohol consumption. Instead, prohibition created the opposite effect. Illegal alcohol became enormously profitable, giving rise to organized crime syndicates like Al Capone's Chicago outfit. Bootleggers, speakeasies, and rum runners became part of American culture. People didn't stop drinking. They just started drinking in secret and often consuming dangerous homemade alcohol that sometimes caused blindness or death. The government spent enormous resources trying to enforce prohibition, but it was largely ineffective. Corruption became widespread as law enforcement officials were bribed to look the other way. Crime rates actually increased during Prohibition, and respect for law and government decreased. After 13 years of this failed experiment, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition in 1933. The United States had learned that making something illegal doesn't make it go away. It just makes it more profitable for criminals. Human ingenuity has given us incredible innovations, but also some spectacularly failed attempts at progress. Blunder number 33, the Vasa's maiden voyage. In 1628, Sweden launched the Vasa, one of the most powerful warships ever built. King Gustavus Adolphus wanted a ship that would demonstrate Swedish naval might and strike fear into the hearts of enemies. The Vasa was designed to be the most heavily armed vessel of its time. on August 10th, 1628. The Vasa set sail from Stockholm harbor in front of cheering crowds. The ship looked magnificent, bristling with 64 bronze cannons and ornate decorations. It sailed about 1,300 meters before a light gust of wind caused it to heel over and sink. The problem was that the Vasa was top-heavy. In their eagerness to create the most impressive warship possible, the designers had packed too many cannons on the upper decks without enough ballast below. The ship was beautiful, powerful, and fundamentally unstable. About 30 people died in the disaster, and Sweden lost its most expensive naval vessel before it could fire a single shot in anger. The Vasa remained on the bottom of Stockholm harbor until 1961, when it was raised and became one of the world's best-preserved 17th century ships, and a monument to the dangers of prioritizing appearance over engineering. Blunder number 34, the Leaning Tower's foundation problem. When construction began on the bell tower of Pisa Cathedral in 1173, the architects had a simple goal: build a tall, elegant tower that would showcase the city's wealth and artistic sophistication. They succeeded in making it tall and elegant, but they overlooked one crucial detail: the foundation. The tower began leaning during construction when they reached the second floor. The soft clay soil on one side couldn't support the weight of the marble structure. A sensible response might have been to stop construction and fix the foundation. Instead, they kept building, trying to compensate for the lean by making the upper floors slightly curved. By the time they finished in 1372, the tower was leaning at a dramatic angle. Over the centuries, it continued to tilt further, threatening to collapse entirely. The Leaning Tower of Pisa became famous precisely because of its fundamental engineering flaw. Ironically, the tower's defect made it one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. Millions of tourists visit Pisa specifically to see the tower that shouldn't be standing. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes become the greatest attractions. Blunder number 35, the Hindenburg's hydrogen problem. The Hindenburg was the pinnacle of 1930s luxury travel, a massive airship that could carry passengers across the Atlantic in comfort and style. It was longer than the Titanic and filled with millions of cubic feet of gas to provide lift. The original design called for helium, which is non-flammable, but the United States had a monopoly on helium production and refused to sell it to Nazi Germany. So the Germans used hydrogen instead, which is highly flammable and explosive. On May 6, 1937, as the Hindenburg approached the mooring mast in New Jersey, static electricity ignited the hydrogen. The entire airship was consumed in flames in just 34 seconds. Of the 97 people on board, 35 died, along with one ground crew member. The disaster was captured on film and radio, with announcer Herbert Morrison's anguished cry of "Oh, the humanity," becoming one of the most famous pieces of broadcast journalism in history. The age of passenger airships ended that day, killed by the decision to use explosive gas in a vehicle designed to carry people. Blunder number 36, the Tay Bridge disaster. The Tay Bridge in Scotland was hailed as an engineering marvel when it opened in 1878. At over 2 miles long, it was the longest bridge in the world, allowing trains to cross the Firth of Tay without taking a lengthy detour. Queen Victoria was so impressed that she knighted the designer, Thomas Bouch. On December 28, 1879, during a severe storm, a passenger train with 75 people aboard was crossing the bridge when disaster struck. A section of the bridge collapsed, taking the train with it into the icy waters below. There were no survivors. The investigation revealed that the bridge had been poorly constructed with inferior materials and inadequate design for wind loads. The disaster destroyed Thomas Boucher's reputation and led to much stricter engineering standards for bridges. The irony is bitter. The bridge that was supposed to showcase Scottish engineering prowess instead became a symbol of engineering hubris. William McGonagall wrote what's often considered the worst poem in English literature about the disaster, ensuring that the Tay Bridge disaster would be remembered in verse as well as history. Sometimes, the biggest disasters come from simple misunderstandings. Blunder number 37. The translation that started a war. In July 1945, Allied leaders meeting at the Potsdam Conference demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally. Japanese Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki responded to reporters' questions about the ultimatum by saying the government would mokusatsu it. Mokusatsu can mean several things in Japanese: to ignore, to withhold comment, or to kill with silence. Suzuki likely meant that the government would withhold comment while they considered their response. But the translators chose ignore, and international news reports stated that Japan was ignoring the surrender demand. This translation may have influenced the American decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman and his advisors believed Japan had definitively rejected surrender, when in reality, they might have simply been buying time to discuss terms. The ambiguity of a single word in translation may have contributed to the deaths of over 200,000 people and changed the course of history. It's a reminder that in diplomacy, precise communication can be a matter of life and death. Blunder 38. The BBC's Spaghetti Tree hoax. On April 1st, 1957, the BBC's current affairs program Panorama broadcast a 3-minute segment about Swiss farmers harvesting spaghetti from trees. The report, narrated with complete seriousness, showed families carefully picking strands of spaghetti from tree branches and laying them in the sun to dry. The presenter explained that the Swiss spaghetti harvest had been particularly good that year, thanks to the elimination of the dreaded spaghetti weevil and an unusually mild winter. The report concluded with footage of a Swiss family sitting down to enjoy a meal of their homegrown spaghetti. Hundreds of viewers called the BBC, asking how they could grow their own spaghetti trees. The BBC reportedly told callers to place a sprig of spaghetti in a tin of tomato sauce and hope for the best. The hoax was so successful because spaghetti was still relatively exotic in 1950s Britain, and many people didn't know it was made from wheat flour. It became one of the most famous April Fool's pranks in history and demonstrated the power of television to convince people of almost anything if it's presented authoritatively. Blunder number 39, the War of the Worlds panic. On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater performed a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. The broadcast was presented as a series of news bulletins reporting a Martian invasion of Earth, complete with live reports from the scene and interviews with experts. Some listeners who tuned in late missed the opening announcement that it was a fictional drama. They heard what sounded like legitimate news reports about alien spacecraft landing in New Jersey and Martian heat rays destroying entire cities. Panic ensued in some areas. People fled their homes, called police stations, and prepared for the end of the world. The reaction wasn't as widespread as sometimes reported, but it was significant enough to make national headlines and turn Wells into a household name overnight. The incident revealed both the power of radio as a medium and the importance of clear disclaimers when presenting fiction as news. It also demonstrated that sometimes the most effective drama is the kind that sounds completely real. Even the world of games and entertainment has produced some legendary blunders. Blunder number 40, the 1904 Olympic Marathon. The marathon at the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis was supposed to showcase American athletic prowess. Instead, it became a comedy of errors that nearly killed several participants. The race was held on August 30th during a brutally hot and humid St. Louis summer. The temperature reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the course was dusty and hilly. Race officials provided only one water station along the entire 26-mile route because they wanted to study the effects of dehydration on human performance. Felix Carbajal, a Cuban mailman, showed up at the starting line wearing street clothes and leather shoes. He had hitchhiked to St. Louis and stopped to eat green apples during the race, which gave him severe stomach cramps. Jan Masciani, a South African runner, was chased off the course by wild dogs. The winner, Thomas Hicks, was given strychnine and brandy by his trainers as a performance enhancer. He hallucinated during the final miles and had to be carried across the finish line. Fred Lors actually won the race, but was disqualified when it was discovered he had ridden in a car for 11 miles. Several runners collapsed from heat exhaustion, and one nearly died. It was less an athletic competition than a medical experiment in human endurance gone wrong. Blunder number 41, the quiz show scandals. In the 1950s, television quiz shows were among the most popular programs on American TV. Shows like 21 and the $64,000 Question made celebrities out of contestants and drew audiences of millions. The problem was that many of these shows were rigged. Producers gave popular contestants the answers in advance to keep them winning and maintain viewer interest. Charles Van Doren, a Columbia University instructor, became famous for winning $129,000 on 21, until it was revealed that he had been coached on the answers. When the scandal broke in 1958, it rocked American television. Congressional hearings were held, careers were destroyed, and the public lost trust in what they had believed was honest competition. The revelation that their favorite contestants were essentially actors following a script felt like a betrayal. The quiz show scandals led to stricter regulations and oversight of television programming. But they also marked the end of an era of innocence in American media, when audiences believed that what they saw on TV was real. Blunder number 42, the Bay City Rollers tax problem. The Bay City Rollers were one of the biggest pop acts of the 1970s, selling millions of records and inspiring roller mania among teenage fans worldwide. At their peak, they were earning enormous sums of money and living the rock star lifestyle. Unfortunately, their financial management was less successful than their music career. Their accountant and manager made a series of catastrophic decisions, including investing the band's money in tax shelter schemes that turned out to be fraudulent. By the early 1980s, despite having earned millions, the band members discovered they were virtually bankrupt. They owed massive amounts in taxes and had almost nothing to show for years of success. Several members had to take regular jobs to survive. The Bay City Rollers' financial disaster became a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding your own finances, no matter how much money you're making. Their story inspired changes in how entertainment contracts are structured and how artists' finances are managed. Sometimes natural disasters become much worse because of human decisions. Blunder number 43, the Great Molasses Flood. On January 15, 1919, a storage tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst in Boston's North End. The result was one of the most bizarre disasters in American history. A wave of molasses, 25 feet high, traveling at 35 miles per hour through the streets of Boston. The molasses wave destroyed buildings, overturned cars, and trapped people in its sticky grip. 21 people died, and 150 were injured. The cleanup took months, and the smell of molasses lingered in the area for decades. The tank had been hastily built and poorly maintained. Warning signs of structural problems had been ignored, and the tank had been leaking for years. The company had painted it brown to hide the molasses stains, rather than fixing the underlying issues. The disaster led to stricter building codes and engineering standards. But it also left Boston with one of the most unusual disaster stories in history, a city attacked by its own sweetener. Blunder number 44, the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was partly a natural disaster caused by drought, but it was made much worse by human agricultural practices. Farmers on the Great Plains had plowed up millions of acres of native grassland to plant wheat, removing the deep-rooted plants that held the soil in place. When drought struck in the early 1930s, the exposed topsoil began to blow away. Dust storms, some thousands of feet high, swept across the plains, burying farms and towns under layers of dirt. The sky turned black during some storms, and dust reached as far as New York City and Washington, D.C. About 3.5 million people left the affected areas, many heading to California as economic refugees. The environmental disaster was made worse by the Great Depression, creating a perfect storm of economic and ecological catastrophe. The Dust Bowl taught harsh lessons about sustainable farming practices and soil conservation. But those lessons came at the cost of one of the worst environmental disasters in American history, caused partly by the hubris of thinking humans could remake the natural world without consequences. Blunder number 45, the London beer flood. On October 17, 1814, a vat containing over 135,000 gallons of beer burst at the Mex and Company Brewery in London. The rupture caused a chain reaction that burst other vats, releasing a total of about 388,000 gallons of beer into the surrounding streets. The flood of beer was 15 feet deep in some areas and destroyed 2 houses. 8 people died, most from drowning in beer, though 1 died from alcohol poisoning. The flood affected several streets in the densely populated area around the brewery. The brewery was taken to court, but the disaster was ruled an act of God, and no compensation was paid to victims' families. The company did, however, receive a refund on the taxes they had paid on the lost beer. The London beer flood became a darkly comic footnote in history, a reminder that even something as harmless as beer can become dangerous in large enough quantities. The digital age has brought new opportunities for spectacular failures. Blunder number 46, the iPhone 4 Antenna Gate. When Apple released the iPhone 4 in 2010, it was hailed as the most advanced smartphone ever made. The sleek design included an external antenna that doubled as the phone's frame, an elegant engineering solution that looked beautiful. There was just one problem. If you held the phone in a normal way, your hand would cover the antenna and cause the signal to drop. Users who gripped their phone naturally often found they couldn't make calls or lost connections in the middle of conversations. Apple's initial response was tone deaf. Steve Jobs reportedly told customers they were holding it wrong and suggested they buy a case or change how they held their phone. The company seemed to blame users for the fundamental design flaw. The controversy became known as Antenna Gate, and seriously damaged Apple's reputation for flawless product design. Eventually, Apple offered free cases to all iPhone 4 owners and changed the antenna design in future models. But it was a humbling reminder that even tech giants can make basic engineering mistakes. Blunder number 47, the Segway's sidewalk problem. The Segway was supposed to revolutionize transportation. Inventor Dean Kamen promised that his self-balancing scooter would be as big a deal as the PC. Cities would be redesigned around Segways, traffic problems would disappear, and walking would become obsolete. When the Segway was unveiled in 2001, it generated enormous excitement. The technology was genuinely impressive. A gyroscope-controlled vehicle that could balance itself and respond to the rider's movements. It looked like something from a science fiction movie. But several problems quickly became apparent. Segways were expensive, costing about $5,000 each. They were heavy, weighing about 80 pounds. They couldn't go upstairs or over curbs easily. Many cities banned them from sidewalks, but didn't allow them on roads either, leaving riders with nowhere to legally ride. Most importantly, they solved a problem that most people didn't have. Walking worked fine for most trips, and cars or bicycles were better for longer distances. The Segway became a symbol of overhyped technology that impressed engineers more than ordinary consumers. Blunder number 48, Google Glass privacy panic. Google Glass was supposed to be the next step in wearable technology. Smart glasses that could display information, take photos, and record video with voice commands. Google envisioned a future where everyone had access to the internet through their eyewear. When Google Glass was released to early adopters in 2013, the reaction was swift and negative. The ability to record video secretly made people uncomfortable. Glass holes became a derogatory term for glass wearers, and some establishments banned the devices entirely. Privacy concerns dominated the conversation about Google Glass. People worried about being recorded without their knowledge, about facial recognition technology, and about the implications of ubiquitous surveillance. The technology that was supposed to feel futuristic instead felt invasive. Google eventually withdrew Google Glass from the consumer market, though it continued to develop versions for enterprise use. The failure demonstrated that technological capability isn't enough if the product makes people uncomfortable or violates social norms. Blunder number 49, the $69 million NFT market collapse. In 2021, the market for NFTs, non-fungible tokens, exploded. Digital artwork, memes, and even tweets were selling for millions of dollars. Beeple's digital artwork, Everyday's, the first 5,000 days, sold for $69 million at Christie's auction house, making him one of the most valuable living artists. The NFT craze seemed to prove that digital ownership was the future of art and collectibles. Celebrities, corporations, and ordinary people rushed to create and buy NFTs. Some predicted that NFTs would revolutionize how we think about digital property and creativity. By 2022, the NFT market had collapsed spectacularly. Most NFTs lost 95% or more of their value. The $69 million Beeple NFT was worth a fraction of its sale price. Many NFT projects turned out to be scams or simply abandoned by their creators. The NFT bubble burst, revealed the difference between technological innovation and actual value. Just because something could be tokenized and sold didn't mean it should be, and the market's collapse left many investors holding expensive digital receipts for assets nobody wanted. Blunder number 50, the metaverse that nobody wanted. In 2021, Facebook rebranded itself as Meta and bet its future on the metaverse, a virtual reality world where people would work, socialize, and play. CEO Mark Zuckerberg predicted that within a decade, most people would spend significant time in virtual worlds. Meta invested billions of dollars in metaverse technology, hiring thousands of engineers and designers to build virtual worlds. The company's promotional materials showed people having meetings as avatars, attending virtual concerts, and buying digital real estate. But when Meta's Horizon Worlds launched, it felt more like an early video game than a revolutionary social platform. The graphics were cartoonish, the virtual worlds were mostly empty, and the VR headsets were expensive and uncomfortable for extended use. User adoption was disappointing. Reports suggested that most people who tried Horizon Worlds didn't return, and the virtual worlds remained sparsely populated. Meta's Reality Labs division lost over $10 billion in 2022 alone, with little to show for the massive investment. The metaverse became a symbol of Silicon Valley's tendency to create solutions for problems that don't exist. While VR technology continues to improve, the idea that people want to live significant portions of their lives in virtual worlds remains unproven. Conclusion: what history's blunders teach us? As we reach the end of our journey through 50 of history's most spectacular blunders, one thing becomes crystal clear. Human beings have an almost supernatural ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, to overthink simple problems, and to ignore obvious solutions while pursuing complicated disasters. From ancient emperors who declared war on the ocean, to modern tech companies that spent billions on virtual worlds nobody wanted, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The tools change, the scale changes, but the fundamental human capacity for magnificent mistakes remains constant. What's fascinating is that many of these blunders weren't caused by stupidity or incompetence. Some of history's greatest mistakes were made by brilliant people: emperors, scientists, engineers, and business leaders who were experts in their fields. Napoleon wasn't stupid when he got defeated by rabbits. The engineers who built the Tacoma Narrows Bridge weren't incompetent. The creators of New Coke weren't trying to destroy their company. Instead, these failures often came from overconfidence, from ignoring warning signs, from believing that complex solutions were better than simple ones, or from assuming that what worked in one situation would work in another. They came from the very human tendency to double down on bad decisions rather than admit mistakes early. Perhaps most importantly, these blunders remind us that failure is an essential part of human progress. The Vasa's sinking led to better ship design. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse revolutionized our understanding of aerodynamics in engineering. The quiz show scandals led to better oversight of television programming. Even the most embarrassing failures often teach valuable lessons, though usually at a much higher cost than anyone intended. In our modern world, where we face challenges from climate change to artificial intelligence to global pandemics, perhaps the most important lesson from history's blunders is this: hubris is dangerous. Simple solutions are often better than complex ones, and it's better to admit mistakes early than to compound them with increasingly desperate measures. The next time you're tempted to declare war on the ocean, build a bridge without considering wind, or invest your life savings in tulips. Remember these 50 tales of magnificent failure. History may not repeat, but human nature certainly rhymes. And who knows, maybe the mistake you're about to make will end up in the next edition of history's biggest blunders. At least you'll be in good company. The question that remains is this: What blunders are we making today that future generations will laugh about? What seems perfectly reasonable to us now, but will appear absurdly obvious as a mistake to people looking back from the few? Only time will tell. But if history is any guide, we can be confident that humans will continue to find new and creative ways to turn triumph into disaster, success into failure, and brilliant plans into cautionary tales. It's what we do best. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's most entertaining disasters. If you enjoyed discovering these incredible true stories of human error, there are countless more waiting to be explored. The past is filled with lessons, laughter, and the occasional reminder that no matter how smart we think we are, we're all capable of spectacular mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes become the most interesting parts of history.